The chalk on the blackboard screamed. To the other students, it was a dry, normal sound, but to David, it was like a fingernail scratching the inside of his skull. He rocked slightly in his chair, a human tide trying to calm the storm of stimuli. The ticking of the clock was a jackhammer. The smell of the girl's perfume next to him was suffocating. The sunlight on the board created a glare that fragmented his vision. But amid the chaos, the numbers on the board were a refuge. They were perfect, logical, predictable. They were the only thing in the room that made sense, until one of them moved out of place, a mistake in the equation, and the screech of chalk was replaced by an error that sounded like thunder in his mind. Clara, David's mother, stirred her coffee, even though it was already cold. The school meeting that day had left the same bitter taste in her mouth. Thomas, her husband, watched her from across the kitchen table, his silence an attempt at support that, at that moment, felt like an abyss. "They called him disruptive again," Clara said, the word coming out like poison. Disruptive, because he rocks his body to calm himself down, because he doesn't look her in the eye when the principal talks to him. They gave me a 3-page report on David's inappropriate social behavior. 3 pages. And in none of them, Thomas, in none of them, was there a single word about the fact that he has read every high school physics book we have in the house. No mention that he took apart our old computer just to understand how it worked. To them, David is a set of symptoms to be managed, not a mind to be nurtured. She stood up, pacing back and forth. "I remember last year's science fair. He spent 2 months building a scale model of the solar system, with gears that made the planets spin in their correct orbits. It was perfect. At the presentation, he got overwhelmed. He couldn't speak. He just stood there, swaying. The teacher gave him a participation grade. For effort, she wrote. Effort. He calculated the damn orbit of Mars, and all they saw was a weird kid who couldn't speak. They want him to fit in. They want him to play ball at recess, to talk about video games. They don't understand that for him, beauty isn't in that. Beauty is in the symmetry of a snowflake, in the logic of a programming code, in the elegance of a mathematical equation. They're trying to teach a bird to swim, and they accuse him of being a bad swimmer, without ever asking themselves if maybe he was meant to fly. And my fear is that one day, if they insist enough, he will end up believing them. He will believe that he is disruptive and inappropriate, and he will stop flying forever." The journey through false hopes was paved with educational reports and well-meaning smiles. Even before David joined Mr. Harrison's class, the school had already implemented an arsenal of inclusion strategies that seemed more like attempts at erasure. There was the socialization plan, spearheaded by the school counselor, Ms. Albright. The idea was to force positive interactions. This translated into David being forced to participate in group games at recess, a chaotic and unpredictable experience that invariably ended with him hiding in the bathroom until the bell rang. Another hope was the social skills tutor, a young psychology student who tried to teach David to maintain eye contact through a sticker reward system. David learned to stare at the point between his tutor's eyes for 3 seconds to earn a star sticker. But the only real result was a new source of anxiety and the feeling that his natural way of being was fundamentally wrong. The most painful of the attempts was social narrative therapy. The school hired a specialist to create short stories that would teach David how to behave in specific situations. When a classmate tells a joke, David should smile, even if he doesn't understand it. Read one of the booklets. Clara and Thomas watched their son try to replicate those scripted emotions, his smile a clumsy and sad mask. Each of these strategies came with a promise. This will help him connect. This will make him more approachable. This will prepare him for the real world. But the real world they were building for David was a stage where he was a terrible actor, forced to memorize lines from a play that made no sense to him. Hope faded with each progress report that measured only his conformity, never his happiness or his intellect. They were so obsessed with smoothing out David's rough edges that they didn't realize they were destroying the precious gem inside. Mr. Harrison was a good teacher, respected, experienced, with a mastery of mathematics that bordered on art. His classroom was a sanctuary of logic and order, and he ruled it with quiet authority. That day, he was at the top of his game, explaining a differential equation on the blackboard, a multi-line monster that would make most adults break out in a cold sweat. He moved with the confidence of a conductor, chalk dancing on his fingers. But perhaps due to lack of sleep or sheer distraction, he made a mistake. A small sign error in one of the variables, a tiny detail, but one that, like a misplaced beam, compromised the entire structure of the equation. He continued, unaware, building his proof on that flawed foundation. At the back of the room, David began to rock faster. The mistake on the board screamed at him, a discordant note in a perfect symphony. He could physically feel the mistake, an itch in his brain. No, no, he whispered, almost inaudibly to himself. A few students nearby heard and laughed softly. There goes the weirdo again, one of them whispered. David's rocking became more intense, his fingers drumming on the table. He squeezed his eyes shut, unable to bear the sight of that logical imperfection. Then, a little louder, the word escaped like a sob. Minus. The sign is minus. Mr. Harrison stopped. He turned, his brow furrowed, irritation beginning to form on his face. He was the master of that room. His authority was based on his infallibility. The interruption, coming from the most disconnected and problematic student in the class, was an affront. "Silence, David," he said, his voice firm, not even considering the possibility. He turned back to the board, ready to continue. But the seed of doubt had been planted. He was at a crossroads, his professional pride on one side, and the bizarre, insistent whisper of his most enigmatic student on the other. Mr. Harrison tried to pick up his train of thought, but David's whisper echoed in his mind. The sign is minus. He looked at the equation. It seemed correct. He had been teaching it that way for 15 years. Ignoring the boy was the easy way out. Sending him to the principal's office for disruptive behavior would be standard procedure. But then something extraordinary happened in the teacher's mind. It was an impulse, an anomaly in his perfectly calculated routine. He remembered David's report, the words, disconnected, isolated. But he also remembered the boy's eyes, which never looked at him, but seemed to see things no one else could see. In a gesture that shocked himself, he put down the chalk. He turned slowly and faced the class, which now watched the scene with morbid curiosity. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The giggles ceased. "What did you say, David?" asked Mr. Harrison, his voice, now devoid of irritation, laden with a neutrality that was even more disconcerting. David cringed, his face pale. He hadn't expected to be noticed. The attention of 30 pairs of eyes was torture. He didn't answer. Mr. Harrison walked slowly past the rows of desks until he stopped beside David. He didn't touch him. He just held out the piece of white chalk. "Show me," he said softly. The entire room held its breath. It was an unthinkable offer, inviting the weirdo, the boy who barely spoke, to come to the blackboard and correct the brightest teacher in the school. David stared at the chalk as if it were a burning coal. His body trembled. He didn't want to, but the mistake on the blackboard pulled him in. The need to restore order was stronger than his fear. Slowly, with trembling legs, he stood up. Each step toward the blackboard was an eternity. That 20-step hallway was the longest journey of his life. The turning point was not a sound, but the stunned silence of an entire school witnessing an act of radical and inexplicable faith. With a trembling hand, David picked up the chalk. The moment his fingers touched the chalky surface, a transformation took place. Fear receded, replaced by intense focus. He was no longer in a room full of people. He was alone with the numbers in his refuge. His hand moved with a speed and certainty that contrasted sharply with his previous hesitation. He didn't erase all of Mr. Harrison's work. With surgical precision, he circled the incorrect plus sign. Next to it, he rewrote that specific part of the equation, now with a minus sign. Then his hand flew across the board, redoing the 3 subsequent lines of calculation, correcting the consequences of that initial mistake. He didn't write any words, just numbers, symbols, and lines. It was pure mathematics, lyrical in its logic. When he finished, he didn't turn to the class. He just put the chalk back on the holder, and without looking at anyone, returned to his desk, shrinking into it as if he wanted to disappear. The room remained in absolute shocked silence. Mr. Harrison stared at the board, not at the mistake he had made, but at the elegance of the correction. It was perfect, brilliant. He turned to the class, his eyes wide. "Well," he said, his voice hoarse, "I think we should all thank David for preventing us from learning a wrong concept today." No one laughed. For the first time, they didn't see the strange boy. They saw a genius. Later, that day, Mr. Harrison called Clara and Thomas. The real victory came when Clara answered, expecting another complaint. "Ma'am," said the teacher, his voice filled with restrained emotion, "I didn't call to talk about your son's behavior. I called to tell you that in 20 years of teaching, I've never seen a mind like his. I'm so sorry I wasn't seeing it." For the first time in years, Clara cried on the phone for a happy reason. The school was empty. The only sound was the hum of the light bulbs and the patter of rain on the windows. Mr. Harrison was alone in his classroom, sitting at one of the student desks, staring at the blackboard. He hadn't erased it. David's perfect, hurried handwriting was still there, next to his own clumsy scribbles. He felt like an imposter in his own classroom. For years he had prided himself on his ability to make math accessible. He believed he was a good teacher, but what had he done to David? He had ignored him. Worse, he had dismissed him. He picked up David's file and read it again. The words jumped out: difficulty interacting, repetitive behavior, resistance to instruction. They were all true, but they were partial, myopic truths. They were descriptions of the packaging, with no mention of the contents. And he, the teacher of logic and reason, had accepted the packaging without question. He, who taught his students to look for evidence and not take anything for granted, had accepted the label problem student for David without seeking any evidence to the contrary. The evidence was there all along in the eyes that shied away from his but devoured the books, in the quietness that was mistaken for disinterest but was, in fact, deep concentration. David's correction on the board was not an act of defiance. It was a cry for help from a brilliant mind, drowning in a system that insisted on treating it as deficient. Mr. Harrison felt a deep sense of shame. He had almost broken the most fundamental rule of his own discipline, that the truth does not care about the appearance of the person who states it. The truth is just the truth. And the truth was that the most brilliant mind he had ever encountered was hidden in the body of the student he understood the least. He wasn't just a teacher who made a miscalculation. He was a man who almost made the mistake of wasting a genius. The incident at the blackboard did not transform David into a talkative and sociable child overnight. He remained David, but the school began to change around him. Mr. Harrison became his biggest supporter. He adapted his method, offering David advanced math challenges to be solved in silence, rather than forcing oral participation. He explained to the class, in simple terms, that there are different kinds of intelligence and we need to respect them all. The mean nicknames faded, replaced by a fearful respect. Some students even began asking David for help with math, sliding a notebook across his desk and waiting for him to point out the mistake: a silent and functional communication. The biggest change was the creation of an extracurricular science and math club, led by Mr. Harrison, which became David's sanctuary. There he could build robots, program, and discuss theoretical physics with the teacher, without the pressure of having to socialize. Clara and Thomas still faced challenges. The world continued to be a noisy and sometimes hostile place for their son. But now, they were no longer alone in their struggle. The school, once a source of frustration, had become an ally. The hope was no longer that David would change to fit into the world. The hope was that the world, or at least that small piece of it, was finally beginning to change to fit David. He still walked the halls as if he were in his own universe, but now no one else saw it as strangeness. They saw it as the unique orbit of a brilliant planet they had finally had the honor of discovering. Genius often doesn't scream for attention. It whispers, at a frequency that only those who are truly willing to listen can hear. If this story made you think, if it touched your heart, show your support. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your interaction helps this message reach further, perhaps even a teacher or parent who needs to be reminded to look beyond the silence today.